Is the European Union facing an existential crisis? Right now, the Bloc looks less like a global power and more like a political punchline, with France alone burning through 4 prime ministers and counting in a single year. But this chaos isn't random. It's the culmination of decades of decay, division, and economic mismanagement now boiling over. That's why today we'll break down why Europe forgot how to grow, how the euro's design is tearing the union apart, and what it all means for the markets and for you. My name is Guy, and you're watching Coin Bureau Finance. First up though, I'm not a financial advisor and nothing in this video should be taken as financial advice. It's educational content designed to help you understand what's going on in Europe's broken economic system. If that sounds good, make sure to smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let's get into it. So, France is in chaos, European bond markets are flashing red, and politicians are playing musical chairs. But this isn't some sudden shock, it's the final act of a story that began more than a decade ago. It all started in the aftermath of the 2008 global financial crisis, when world leaders faced a simple choice. Either stimulate their economies and invest in growth, or tighten their belts to reduce deficits. The United States and China chose stimulus and reignited their economies. Europe, on the other hand, led by Germany's obsession with schwarze Null, or black zero, chose austerity instead. Nearly 2 decades on, that choice is now seen as one of the greatest acts of economic self-sabotage in modern history. Europe's share of global GDP fell from 20% in 2000 to just 14% by 2023. So, while its competitors were busy building the future, Europe was busy balancing budgets and cutting corners. As former European Central Bank, or ECB chair Mario Draghi once put it, Europe has become an aging giant, trapped in a slow and agonizing decline. At the heart of that decline lies one simple truth: Europe forgot how to grow. Productivity has flatlined, innovation has stalled, and an aging population is leaving too few young workers to carry the load. And while Europe still competes in traditional industries like automotive and manufacturing, it's failed to ride any of the new innovation waves, from the internet to, quite frankly, everything that's come since. Just look at the numbers. The average age of Europe's 5 largest companies is close to 100 years, while in the United States it's just under 40. Not a single European company worth more than 100 billion euros has been built from scratch in the last 50 years. And since 2008, a third of Europe's most promising startups, its so-called unicorns, have left the continent altogether, moving to places where they can actually scale. Private sector investment tells the same story. Businesses in Europe spend just 1.2% of GDP on research and development, barely half the level of the US. Combine that with a labyrinth of regulations and sky-high energy costs, and it's little wonder that both talent and capital keep fleeing to friendlier markets. And speaking of energy, that is where Europe's self-sabotage becomes almost comical. When Russian gas supplies were cut off in 2022, Germany, Europe's industrial powerhouse, decided to decommission its remaining nuclear power plants. That decision crippled heavy industry, sent energy prices soaring, and made entire sectors uncompetitive almost overnight. You couldn't script a worse policy if you tried. Then there's the labour problem. Europe is bleeding talent. Millions of highly educated workers are heading to the US, UK, and elsewhere in search of better opportunities. More often than not, they're being replaced by lower-skilled migrants, many of whom rely on government support, putting even more strain on welfare systems built by the very taxpayers who are now leaving. Meanwhile, around 100 million Europeans are at risk of falling into poverty. Now, this economic decay has produced a political consequence that Europe's elites can no longer ignore: an angry, disillusioned electorate. And frankly, who can blame them? When millions are struggling with rising living costs and collapsing public services, people start demanding answers. But when the establishment can't provide complex solutions, simple ones begin to sound far more appealing. And this is the foundation of Europe's ongoing political earthquake. Support for populist parties has tripled since the 1990s, from around 10% of the vote to nearly 30% today. And you can see this most clearly in Germany, where the far-right Alternative für Deutschland, or AfD, has surged to become the main beneficiary of public anger. Much of that anger stems from unpopular, expensive green policies, like the controversial heating law that forced households to spend tens of thousands of euros installing heat pumps. So, even as major investors like BlackRock have quietly distanced themselves from the ESG narrative, Brussels, Berlin, and other European governments continue doubling down on it. But the revolt isn't just about policy, it's also about trust. A growing share of Europeans see their leaders as corrupt, insulated, and unaccountable. Investigations have revealed that nearly a quarter of EU lawmakers have faced scandals ranging from harassment to full-blown bribery cases like Qatargate and Huaweigate. Worse still, many of these cases appear to be selectively prosecuted, with opposition politicians targeted more aggressively than those inside the establishment. And nowhere is the erosion of trust more visible than in the European Commission itself, particularly under its current president, Ursula von der Leyen, whose tenure has been marked by secrecy and evasion. Perhaps the clearest example came when journalists demanded details about the multi-billion-euro Pfizer vaccine deal, only to be told there was no official record, because the negotiations had been conducted over text message. To the average European, this looks less like governance and more like an elite bureaucracy closing ranks. And just when Europe could least afford this internal decay, the final shock arrived from the United States. The long-standing transatlantic alliance that anchored Europe's security for nearly 80 years came to an abrupt end on Valentine's Day 2025, when US Vice President J.D. Vance told European leaders that the partnership could no longer be taken for granted. His message was clear. America's new priority isn't defending Europe. It's fighting its own cultural battles domestically. To drive the point home, Vance refused to meet the German Chancellor and instead sat down with the leader of the AfD, a move that sent shockwaves through European capitals. Leaked group chats later made things even worse, revealing that Vance and his defense secretary reportedly said they, quote, hate bailing Europe out again, and called European allies, quote, freeloading and pathetic. To the US, Europe seems less like a partner and more like a burden. Now, as if political division weren't enough, the final crack in Europe's foundation runs straight through its currency, the euro itself. It all started when Germany, the poster child of fiscal discipline, tore up its own rulebook. After Trump's foreign policy shake-up, Berlin scrapped its debt brake and pushed through a €1 trillion stimulus, covering everything from rearmament to infrastructure. After decades of forcing austerity on everyone else, Germany had just given itself permission to borrow at will, effectively declaring that the old fiscal order no longer applied. That decision confirmed what economic historian Russell Napier has been warning about for years. The Eurozone is structurally broken, and the European Central Bank can no longer function as a true central bank. The contradiction is simple. How can the ECB set a single interest rate for a union where France's total debt, public, private, and household, sits above 350% of GDP, while Germany's is closer to 200%. The answer is, it can't. To save France, the ECB would need to create years of sustained inflation, around 6 to 7% for more than a decade, to inflate away its debt. But that's politically impossible. Why should Germans tolerate France's fiscal spending spree? And that's the heart of the problem. Because the ECB can't solve it, the power to create money is quietly shifting back to the national level, to 20 separate governments, each now doing their own thing. That is the death knell for a single currency. And what we're seeing here is what Napier calls financial repression, a quiet return to state-directed credit, where governments decide who gets funding and savers quietly foot the bill. And this isn't just theory anymore. Across Europe, governments are already telling banks where to lend and guaranteeing the risk. In Spain and Italy, for instance, almost 100% of corporate loan growth is state-backed. Meanwhile, pension funds are being nudged, or rather cornered, into buying domestic government bonds at politically convenient rates. In other words, Berlin will set the German yield curve, Paris will set the French one, and so on. It's the quiet dismantling of monetary unity in real time. And if there's one country that could deliver the final blow, it's France. This October, its Prime Minister lasted just 14 hours in office. That came after Fitch had already downgraded France's credit rating to A+, citing deep political paralysis. You can only imagine what they're thinking at this point. But the numbers tell the rest of the story. A 6% budget deficit, double the EU limit, with new borrowing used just to refinance old debt. As a result, France's 10-year bond now yields about 3.5%, while its 30-year is above 4.3%, 8 times higher than during the COVID era. And the ECB's response? President Christine Lagarde insists there's no rush to intervene, that markets are functioning fine and France just needs to stick to the budget rules. But behind the tough talk, it's clear the ECB can't let France, the Eurozone's second largest economy, go under. Yet stepping in to save it could be the very thing that destroys the entire Euro project. So, will the EU just sit on its hands and let everything fall apart? Of course not. It has a plan. And, as always in Brussels, that plan is less about fixing the problem and more about maintaining control. At its core, it's a two-pronged strategy, designed to make sure that even if the euro stumbles, Europe's elites keep their grip on capital and on you. Their problem is simple. The money is leaving. As Mario Draghi himself admitted, the EU needs around 800 billion euros of annual investment to fund its ideological priorities, from green energy to defence. Meanwhile, European savers are sending roughly 300 billion euros a year into foreign markets. The first part of the solution is the Savings and Investment Union, or SIU. Officially, it's about helping Europeans invest their savings instead of leaving them idle in bank accounts. But, as always with EU initiatives, the devil is in the details. The real goal is to funnel Europe's 10 trillion euros in household savings into EU-aligned assets. This won't happen through outright confiscation, at least not yet. Instead, it'll come through auto-enrolment. Workers will find their pensions quietly redirected into funds managed by institutions like BlackRock, whose mandates, conveniently, align with Brussels' agenda. The plan targets retail investors, asking them to put life savings into illiquid small and medium-sized enterprises while disclaiming any liability if things go wrong. In other words, if you lose money, don't come complaining to Brussels. But when the carrot doesn't bring in enough money, the EU reaches for the stick, the digital euro. The European Central Bank's drive to launch a central bank digital currency, or CBDC, has been fueled by fear. Fear that dollar-backed stablecoins could undermine the euro. So, to stay relevant, the ECB has even discussed deploying its digital currency on public blockchains such as Ethereum or Solana. But make no mistake, this isn't innovation, it's about control. As the Bank for International Settlements chief Augustin Carstens bluntly put it, central banks will have, quote, absolute control over how CBDCs are used, with limits on holdings, spending caps, and, conveniently, the power to impose negative interest rates directly. That means your balance could shrink in real time, not from inflation, but because the ECB decides to delete a portion of your savings unless you spend or invest it in approved assets, such as green bonds. To keep up appearances, the ECB is trying to rebrand programmability as conditional payments and outsource restrictions to commercial banks. But since those banks answer to the ECB, the control remains entirely centralized. It's a system built on coercion and misallocated capital, and, as history shows, it always ends the same way, in a crisis followed by a reset. Which brings us to the big question: what does all of this mean for you and for the markets? Well, let's start with the obvious. The euro is on borrowed time. The ECB is playing a dangerous game of chicken, pretending it can enforce fiscal discipline while knowing it can't let France fail. The only thing keeping spreads from exploding is the market's belief that the ECB will eventually blink. But that belief is misplaced. The euro's flaws are structural, and its decline will be slow, political, and deeply painful. As national governments take control of credit creation, the logical next step is capital controls, where stronger states, likely Germany, are forced to restrict the flow of newly created euros to weaker ones. It would mark the effective end of the single currency, even if the name euro remains. But a crisis doesn't just destroy wealth, it also redistributes it. In this new era, returns aren't earned through competition, they're assigned through policy. The winners will be the companies that align with government spending priorities, and the losers will be those tied to the old free market order. The so-called naughty step will include passive index investing, legacy financial firms, and anything built on leverage and yield extraction. So think private equity or traditional investment banking. Their game is practically over. The good step, on the other hand, lies with capital expenditure. Europe is being forced to rebuild, and governments will make sure those projects get funded, no matter the cost. That's where the cheap, politically guaranteed money will flow. Then, of course, there are censorship-resistant assets like gold and Bitcoin. But in this environment, self-custody is everything. If you're holding exposure through ETFs or custodial wallets, you're not protecting yourself, you're volunteering to be controlled. But beyond the markets, something even larger is shifting. The age of a unified, Western-led Europe is fading. Populations are demanding tighter immigration policies, pragmatic energy plans, and fewer ideological crusades. As a result, we're already seeing European leaders soften their stance towards China and other emerging powers, with the geopolitical centre of gravity tilting eastward. And while it might sound far-fetched, just look around. The transatlantic alliance is fractured, the European project is faltering, and Washington's volatility makes long-term partnership almost impossible. So, if the US isn't holding Europe together anymore, maybe no one will. Let's just hope then that the coming reset brings reform and not ruin. Okay, if you enjoyed that video, then let us know by hitting the like button and subscribe to the channel to get more content like this to help you navigate the world of modern finance. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you again very soon. This is Guy, signing off.